Ready? Yeah, I'm Mark Morial. I'm president and CEO of the National Urban League. And today, the leaders of the nation's leading civil rights and racial justice organizations, as well as three of our leaders in Congress, Representative Karen Bass and Senators Cory and Kamala Harris, have come together in response to the challenges ravaging America's cities today. Each of these leaders will speak after I share with you an opening statement on our behalf. The tragic and senseless loss of Black lives to police-involved violence over the last several years, and the callous indifference to justice in response should have been enough to persuade this nation of the need for dramatic change. The last several days have made it impossible to ignore. We call on the nation to join the civil rights community in observing a national day of mourning on Thursday as George Floyd's family prepares for the painful task of laying their loved one to rest. We will spend the day in reflection and prayer for racial reconciliation and an end to the violence that is ravaging the nation. Our communities, already saturated in grief over COVID-19, the pandemic and the disparities, have been pushed to the brink and pushed to the edge by relentless police brutality and vigilante injustice. Now, white nationalists, among others, intent on stoking divisions and discrediting the racial justice movement, have smashed their way into this cauldron of anguish and rage. There is only one way out of this crisis. The rift between the police and communities they are sworn to protect can be healed only by a comprehensive and realistic plan for reform and accountability. The brutal killings of Black people and other people of color by police and vigilantes, as well as the appalling, inappropriate response by some police to peaceful uprisings, highlight the need for comprehensive review and revision of police training procedures, hiring standards, and use of force policies, among a number of ideas. We look forward to working closely with members of Congress. We look forward to mobilizing local elected officials, community leaders, and faith leaders on a broad basis without regard to partisanship to advance these policies and others desperately needed to reform things in this country. We stand with the impacted families and communities as they remember and mourn George Floyd, Sean Reed, Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, and countless of others. We will not, we cannot, and we shall not rest until we get true justice for African Americans and other marginalized communities and this nation, particularly for those who bear the brunt of police violence. I'm proud at this time to recognize Representative Karen Bass, the chair of the Congressional Black Caucus and a member of Congress from the great state of California and the city of Los Angeles and beyond. Representative Bass.
Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. I am proud to join in the collaborative effort with all of the civil rights leaders. I will say that there are many of us on this call who have been in this fight for more decades than we want to talk about. I know that everybody on this call has been in this fight for many, many years. And we have to ask ourselves and we have to ask the country, at what point will we grow tired of seeing people literally executed on video and nothing happens? We have to say that this is one of the most, not the most, one of the most egregious episodes that I have seen in my lifetime. And this is where we say it has to end. I am proud of all of the people out seriously protesting. but I am dismayed at those who would, in an opportunistic fashion, take advantage of this moment, shift the agenda away from the issue by creating violence and looting. The Congressional Black Caucus is literally at this moment in the midst of an emergency meeting. While we are reviewing our response, the number one issue, the number one tactic will be collaboration, building a broad, united front, a movement that will fight to make sure that Congress does the right thing and that the state houses do the right thing. Our collaboration in the Congress involves the other ethnic caucuses, the Latinx caucus, the Asian Pacific Islander caucus, the Native American caucus. We are all going to be in solidarity in pushing for a comprehensive, transformative legislative agenda, not just an agenda that hits at the surface, but an agenda that goes to the core of police accountability and changing the laws that make it so difficult to hold the police accountable. So I'm happy to join in this effort. We need to be as visible as possible in this fight because we want especially the young people in our country to know that we are dedicated to sticking with this issue until we have a police department that protects and serves our people in the same way the police department protects and serves other communities. Right now, that is not the relationship that our communities have with police departments. Thank you so much, Mr.
Thank you, Representative Bass. Senator Kamala Harris of California.
Thank you, Mark, and for bringing us together, the National Urban League. Listen, America is raw right now, and her wounds are exposed. Let's just go through a few of the names, the many names: George Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, Michael Brown, Trayvon Martin, Eric Garner, Philando Castile, Sandra Bland, Laquan McDonald, Tamir Rice, Jordan Davis, the son of a member of Congress, Alton Sterling, Freddie Gray, Sean Reed. And we remember the countless others, including the Black men and women who never had their killing captured by video and whose families have fought and shouted for justice and that they would be believed. And so we need to speak their names, we need to honor them all, and we need to act. And we have to speak truth about this moment. People are protesting because Black people in America have been treated as less than human by history and today. People are protesting in America because our country has never fully addressed historical and systemic racism. And the people have a right to be heard. We must focus on why they are protesting. Why are they protesting? And I believe part of the problem is that we have two systems of justice in America, and we need to make it a country that is true to its ideals, where we say equal justice under the law. We need to have that mean something. And we have to work together. We have to work together for concrete solutions that will help get rid of a broken system that has stolen Black lives for far too long. And I want to highlight just a couple of the bills that we're working on with a national standard for use of force. It should not be that when prosecutors bring these cases around the country, the standard of proof is insurmountable because it only asks the question, was the use of excessive force reasonable? Instead of what the question should be, which is asking, was that use of force necessary? We also need independent investigations of police use of force cases. And I say that as a former prosecutor. It should not be the state's attorney's office or the DA's office that works every day with that police department, which is doing the investigation. We must have independence for the sake of community trust and transparency and for the sake of justice. We also have to restore the United States Department of Justice's responsibility to investigate patterns and practice of discrimination. This is work I've done as Attorney General. It is necessary because often where there may be one bad apple, there's a whole bunch of bad apples. And that is why it is important that we have investigations of pattern and practice of discrimination where we have a concern that that may be occurring. We also have to restore the United States Department of Justice's responsibility to oversee and enforce consent decrees, which only come about because there has been a showing and proof of discrimination, of misconduct, and a court then has the responsibility of overseeing the reforms. These are the things we must demand. We must demand a national officer misconduct registry, where again, we bring transparency to the American public and we have the ability to know who and where they are when they are carrying a gun and a badge if they've been found to have committed misconduct in their jurisdiction or another jurisdiction. And in closing, I'll just say that we cannot continue to have two systems of justice in America based on where you live or the color of your skin. That's why the people are in the streets protesting. That's why we are witnessing the pain, the anguish, the frustration, and the anger. And yes, the anger. Because when people have had to be subjugated, when people have been made to feel less than whole by a system, you will see the kinds of response that we are seeing today. So I call on us to do everything in our power. And of course, I join for a National Day of Mourning. And I thank you again, the National Urban League, for bringing us all together. Thank you, Mark.
Thank you, Senator Harris. Senator Cory Booker of New Jersey.
Thank you, Mark Morial, for your leadership. I want to thank my two congressional colleagues, friends, and incredible allies, Karen Bass, and then my partner and sister in the Senate, Kamala Harris, for their extraordinary leadership, as well as the other civil rights leaders who are on this call. I join them in a chorus of conviction for a National Day of Mourning, as well as making sure that the federal government takes specific actions. We live in a nation that race, unfortunately, still deeply, deeply determines what type of justice you receive in America. And from criminal justice issues to environmental justice issues to economic justice issues, healthcare access, and more, we have so much work to do. But persistent and unchecked bias in policing and this deep history of a lack of accountability are wreaking havoc in African-American communities. And we are seeing the protests, millions of people expressing outrage for change. There is no singular policy that will fix this whatsoever. But we need an entire set of holistic reforms. That's a package I just announced earlier today. It's seeking to create a comprehensive set of reforms. In a sense, this package will include three things that will finally help us to get at the deep-seated problems that our justice system and policing practices evidence, and make instances of this type of police violence, what are right now so common, begin to make them what they should be, parts of a wretched past for this history. And so number one pillar we need to do is to hold police accountable for the egregious misconduct that we see regularly across this country. The laws are written now, the way the laws are written make that too difficult. We have to fix them by reforming Section 242, the federal statute governing police misconduct, by modifying the intent standard necessary to prove a case, and by reforming qualified immunity doctrine so that individuals are entirely barred from recovering damages when police violate their constitutional rights. The second big bucket, we need to improve transparency into policing by collecting better and more accurate data of police brutality and use of force. Right now, we have a deeply incomplete picture. How do we solve this problem if we do not have the needed data? So we need to require departments to actually report use of force incidences to the DOJ, and we need a national police misconduct registry so problematic officers can't bounce from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. And lastly, number three, we have to solve this issue on the front end. We cannot simply wait until an officer has assaulted an unarmed Black person or any person to seek justice. We need to improve police training and practices so we prevent these incidents from occurring in the first place. That means things like requiring bias training, banning religious and racial profiling, incentivizing states to ban or restrict things like no-knock warrants and chokeholds. We know that these and other practices only increase the chance that violent tragedies will occur, and they must be stopped. We are a nation that has the capacity to make change. You are seeing manifest all over this country from protesters and activists, even police officers themselves, who are calling for change. The will is there. We need to ensure that laws are changed, legislation is passed, or you're destined to continue to see these spasms be made real when awful tragedies are captured on videotape. Thank you very much.
Senator Booker, thank you very much. And I want to thank Senator Booker, Senator Harris, and Representative Bass, because we know their schedules are very demanding, for working with us and for being with us today as we stand in solidarity. I want to say to all of the members of the media, do not forget to type your questions in and include identification of your media organization as well as your name. We want to go now to Kristen Clarke, head of the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights. She's got another engagement in a few minutes, and let's hear from Kristen Clarke now.
Thanks so much, Mark, for bringing us together, and many thanks to our members of Congress who always serve as our moral compass during moments of crisis like this. What we are witnessing across the country right now is a perfect storm. The pandemic, 41 million Americans who are unemployed, and unchecked police violence. African Americans lie at the epicenter of these crises. We're dealing with unspeakable devastation right now. Communities that are on the brink of financial ruin, and families that are broken from police violence. The events that we are all witnessing show the depths of Black suffering across the country. Communities that are subject to systemic racial discrimination, rendering them more vulnerable to the pandemic, to unemployment, and to targeting by police. Those marching and demonstrating could not be clearer. The status quo of police violence perpetrated against African Americans will no longer be tolerated. Racism infects virtually every stage of our criminal justice system, from policing all the way through who gets the death penalty. The videos that are capturing these incidents have made it impossible for us to look away. We stand in solidarity with communities that are marching and calling for long overdue reform of policing in our country. In no uncertain terms, we condemn President Trump's continued efforts to escalate tensions at this moment. From calling protesters thugs to inciting and glorifying violence, his words and actions have fanned the flames and escalated levels of racial tension from every corner of our country. We are pleased with the recent appointment of Attorney General Ellison to handle the case of Mr. Floyd. Fair and independent investigation and prosecution is key to ensuring that the proper handling of police violence cases. Finally, I want to close by noting that voting is the most powerful form of protest. That said, we are deeply concerned regarding the mass deployment of the National Guard, state police, and local law enforcement on the eve of Tuesday's elections. There are several states where voters are scheduled to go to the polls tomorrow, and mass law enforcement presence can intimidate Black voters who already face significant obstacles to the ballot this season. I'll note that America's protests are a reflection of our current environment, and if we want to change the content of these protests, we've got to change the environment that Black Americans are experiencing. Thank you, Mark, for having me.
Thank you, Kristen. Thank you for your statement. And now we'll go to Reverend Al Sharpton.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you, Mark, and I'm honored and happy to join my colleagues in civil rights leadership, as well as Chairwoman Bass and Senators Kamala Harris and Cory Booker. Let me say, as we are preparing for the memorial service in Minneapolis on this coming Thursday, I was talking to the family members and told them that as we funeralized Eric Garner and Michael Brown, we always would say, let this be the last one. And I'm sure that as I do the eulogy on Thursday and throughout the weekend, we will hear people say that again. But the only way it is going to be the last time is we must change the law and the enforcement of the law. We must, unlike ever before, have our legislators, our civil rights leaders, our practitioners come together and stay together and have laws that will hold police accountable, that will narrow the scope of what they are permitted to do, so they do not have these broad laws that can be interpreted to justify any type of inaction and any type of over-the-top behavior. The way the laws are written now, they can justify choking a man to death, putting a knee on a man, because they are not required to prove that there was no other way to de-escalate a situation by law. So as we go through the protests, and nobody protests more than National Action Network, we're out there now with many of those around the country. As we go through the drama, and we do that because that comes out of the King movement, you must dramatize the issue to have an issue. We must do it toward law. What did they do in the 60s? The drama of the Freedom Riders, the drama of Dr. King going to jail in Albany led to the Civil Rights Act of '64. The drama of the Selma March, Hosea Williams and John Lewis beat on the Edmund Pettus Bridge, helped to lead to the Voting Rights Act and on to the Open Housing Act. But they worked together with the Legal Defense Fund and the Thurgood Marshals of that time. And they worked together with those that were in the legislature. We had Adam Powell in the Congress. We had Dr. King in the South. We had Thurgood Marshall and others in the North, all at the same time. And what you're seeing coming together around this issue of George Floyd is that reconnection of our forces coming together, saying, you handle this lane, we'll handle that lane, but we're all going to get to this highway together. This president has made it clear that we must unite, but we must unite around tangible, concrete change. Nobody remembers who had the biggest crowd in 1962, but they remember the Civil Rights Act of '64. We cannot stop until we have reformed policing and made it fair and even for every American. This is not about which is the biggest rally and who gets the most profile on TV or in the newspapers. This is about what all of it, did we change the law and protect people under the execution of the law? We, for that reason, also join my colleagues in saying that we cannot become like the people we're fighting. Violence is not an option. Violence becomes a distraction. The Floyd families called on it, and we are calling on it because, yes, we understand the anger. Yes, we understand the outrage. Yes, we understand the sense of despair. I told the young people as we spoke in Minneapolis on Thursday when I brought Eric Garner's mother down. I preached Eric Garner's funeral. I preached Michael Brown's funeral in Ferguson. Nobody more angry at me than to actually go and see some of these mothers claim the bodies. And I watched them brought out of looking like it's an icebox. So nobody has more rage than me, but rage is not going to solve this unless that rage is channeled in a concrete way. So that's why I wanted to be part of this call. That's why when our sister Sherrilyn Ifill called us and said, we've got to do some collective at this moment, is we must seize this moment. And that's the call we're going to give on the day of mourning on Thursday. That's the call I will give from the eulogy. that we've got to seize this moment to change the time. Otherwise, we will end up with the forces that are opposed to us being victorious. I will never forget, and I'll close on this, Mark. I was 13 years old. I was youth director of Operation Breadbasket, New York, founded by Dr. King. It was the year he was killed. When Dr. Martin Luther King was killed, cities all over the country went up in flames. There were riots everywhere. The forces against Dr. King used that to come with law and order. And that same November 1968, Richard Nixon became president. Let us not make the same mistakes of letting our rage guide us to something that is against our interests. We're nonpartisan. I'm not telling people who to vote for, but I am going to tell them what to vote for. Let's vote for justice, and let's behave in a way that we can add to those that will stand for justice, no matter who they vote for, rather than scare them away from a movement whose time has come. Thank you, Mark.
Thank you very much, Reverend Al. We'll go to Melanie Campbell, then to Sherrilyn Ifill. Melanie?
Thank you, Mark. Thank you to all my colleagues, and thank Congresswoman Bass, Senators Harris and Booker. As we, in this moment, trying to keep myself together in this moment, I join my colleagues in calling for this National Day of Mourning and a collective call to action. As Fannie Lou Hamer always said, we're just so sick and tired of being sick and tired. I want to special shout out also to all of our organizations on this call, all of our young people who are on the front lines along with us, and those who were just for the first time stepping out and say enough is enough, not just in this country, but all over the world. Enough is enough. I lift up the families of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and Ahmaud Arbery and so many others that Reverend has laid out, and others who have been killed unjustly by police, or those who want to be police. It's time for change. Our country is demanding it. We're demanding it. We're sick and tired. So change has to happen, and it has to happen now. And as we all said, elections are coming. And for those who don't stand with us, we know how to use our ballot. We're in trauma on top of it. Not just the trauma of these killings and the civil unrest that's taking place, but the trauma of coronavirus. So those who are stepping out in the streets are also impacted. African Americans, we're dying more than anybody else. And so to be able to step out here and protest means that we're also taking our lives at risk of being shot, but also catching this coronavirus that's impacting us. So again, I thank all of my colleagues. I thank those who are stay in the streets, but be safe, be strategic. Don't let them hijack our movement. Thank you, Mark.
Thank you very much, Melanie. I appreciate you.
Moving forward.
Thank you. We'll go to Sherrilyn Ifill.
Thank you, Mark, and thank you to all my civil rights colleagues and to our elected leaders who've come together to talk today and to strategize and to collectively express our frustration, our outrage, but also our determination for things to be different. We should remember that this nation erupted in unrest in 1964, in 1965, in 1966, in 1992. Each time was because of police violence against unarmed African Americans. You all have seen me over the last 5 years talking about this issue. You saw me talk about Eric Garner and Walter Scott and Frank Gray and so many of the others who have been killed by police officers. But like you, I feel this time is different. And I think many of the protests that we see demonstrate that all over this country, people feel this time is different. Why is it different? It's different because we've made our petition. We've lifted the issue. We were told that once People saw it on video, change would happen. And yet still change has not come. We were on the road to change during the Obama administration, when we had an administration that took seriously the issue of structural racism in law enforcement. And we've been turned back from that by this new administration. For me personally, I will tell you that this time is different, because when I saw the image of Officer Derrick Johnson taking the life of George Floyd with his hands in his pockets and looking at people videotaping him, everything about his stance and his face said that he felt confident that there would be no accountability for him taking the life of George Floyd. And as a lawyer, as the head of the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, the oldest legal civil rights organization in the country, I walk in the footsteps of our founder, Thurgood Marshall. I pledged my life to using the law and the justice system to reach and to attain the full dignity and citizenship of Black people in this country, as promised and guaranteed under the 14th Amendment to the Constitution. But even I have to admit, when I saw the picture of that officer, that we have failed in our justice system. If he could have that expression on his face that suggested he knew there would be no accountability. And so that makes this time different, and therefore we've got to get focused on what we need to make change happen. I know that there are people saying, but this is under the Trump administration. And I'm telling you that this may be the moment under the most pressing time when we are being commanded by the spirit of our ancestors, by our own determination, by the mothers who have lost too many sons, by the mothers who have lost too many daughters, when the voices are speaking to us and telling us, no matter what the moment, you must make justice happen. And so I want to suggest to you, among the many measures that have been discussed already on this call and will be discussed, 5 that I think are important. 3 are at the national level and 2 are local. First and foremost, you already heard Senator Kamala Harris talk about the need for a national registry of police officers. We need a system whereby police officers who engage in misconduct will be known and can be decertified. That is, lose their privileges to be police officers if they engage in certain kinds of misconduct. The police call themselves a profession. I am in a profession, the legal profession. Professions are guided by standards. And if we violate those standards, we can be denied the ability to be part of that profession. And so we need a national database of police officers. We need to know who are the officers engaged in brutality. And we need the ability to decertify those officers so they cannot be just hired by another department. We need to change the law of qualified immunity, the judge-made doctrine that creates a defense for police officers. The result of this doctrine and the way it's been interpreted by courts has resulted in near impunity for police officers who engage in this kind of brutality and violate the constitutional rights of African Americans. That's why Officer Chauvin had that look on his face. The law of qualified immunity can be addressed by the United States Congress. There are a number of cases pending in the United States Supreme Court challenging this doctrine, and it's time we turn our attention to it. We also have to turn our attention to the Department of Justice, now led by Attorney General William Barr. The Department of Justice has the power under the Law Enforcement Misconduct Act, a piece of legislation we were able to attain after the unrest following the verdicts in the Rodney King case. They have the power to investigate systematic discrimination by police departments, patterns and practices of discrimination. They did it in Baltimore, they did it in Ferguson, and it's a vital tool to the transformation of policing. But that tool has been left unused by both Attorney General Sessions and Attorney General Barr, who has instead decided that he will focus on what he calls Antifa. We need to demand that the Attorney General do his job and conduct a pattern and practice investigation of the Minneapolis Police Department. We should also remember that the Justice Department is responsible for funding and providing grants to police jurisdictions around the country. Over $2 billion of United States taxpayer money a year goes from the Department of Justice to local police departments. You can find out what your police department receives from the federal government if you go to the Thurgood Marshall Institute National Police Funding Database. We provide that money, but Title VI of the Civil Rights Act says that we are not allowed to give federal money to programs that engage in discrimination. And yet that has never been rigorously applied to police funding. It's time to make that happen. Now, here are 2 local actions so that when you're engaged in your day of mourning, you can mourn and you can pray. But I'm also asking you to go online and find your local jurisdiction's police union contract. In many places, the police union contract is being negotiated as we speak, including in Minneapolis. These contracts often contain the provisions that shield police officers from having to appear within 72 hours of having killed an unarmed citizen, from bystander officers being required to intervene when they see their colleagues engaged in misconduct, all kinds of provisions that ensure impunity for police officers. I'm asking you to look at the police union contract in your local jurisdiction and find out when that contract is up for renewal and reach out to your mayor and tell them what you want to see in that contract. And then finally, I'm asking you to focus on funding. Police departments receive huge portions of the budget of most cities in our country. We need to recalibrate that funding. We need more funding for mental health services, for youth services, for homelessness services. We need to train people in nonviolent conflict resolution. Every time we have a problem in the community should not be the cause to call 911. Right now, police departments are eating a disproportionate share of the funding in our communities. And I'm asking you on your day of mourning to also spend time looking at how your city is funding the services that our communities need and making your voice heard about recalibrating that funding. This has to be different this time. And that means that every one of us has to be involved and has to take on both national and local measures to make this change. I want to serve in a justice system that is just. I work, and the staff of the Legal Defense Fund works every day to make it so. And we are working even harder after this latest tragedy. But we need your help. You can find more information on the website of the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. You can follow us or me on social media. And I ask you all to keep the faith and keep your eyes on the prize.
Thank you, Sherrilyn. Excellent. Let's go to Vanita Gupta and then Derrick Johnson, and then we'll go to the questions. And if my colleagues can stay, we've got 10 questions in the queue right now. Vanita?
Good afternoon. Thank you, Mark, and to the National Urban League for convening this call. And to my civil rights colleagues who work tirelessly every day to build an America as good as its ideals. We've got to take urgent and comprehensive action to protect Black communities from the systemic perils of police misconduct and brutality. And we have leaders like Representative Bass, Senators Harris and Booker, who have had a continued leadership on these issues on policing and justice reform. I want to thank them for being with us today. There's little question that the searing pain on display in Minneapolis and across the country, this is pain that we are all feeling deeply, demands more. We have been through this cycle over and over again, but we need to make George Floyd's life count for permanent change in this country. George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and so many others who have lost their lives to state violence deserve more. And for too long, our nation has met the cycle of police brutality and racism with tinkering at the edges instead of real change. In the coming days, Congress has to take police accountability and make it a top priority. But communities around the country need to take this up, and there are concrete steps. And my colleague and sister in the fight, Sherrilyn Ifill, laid out very important and concrete steps. I want to just add and underscore, we need to make sure that we are establishing finally a national standard that limits the use of force to only when necessary and bans excessive force maneuvers like chokeholds and knee and neck restraints that have been banned by many police departments but still continue as lawful in parts of the country. We've got to promote greater police accountability by reforming and changing the qualified immunity doctrine and giving federal prosecutors, from the Civil Rights Division at the Justice Department, more charging options to successfully hold law enforcement accountable for the deprivation of civil rights and civil liberties. We've got to prohibit profiling and require robust data collection on police community encounters. It is shocking that even to this day in this country, we still do not have an adequate database about who is dying in police custody. And we've got to create a national database that Sherrilyn and Senator Harris have both mentioned on police misconduct, so that law enforcement leaders don't hire officers with histories of disciplinary actions over and over again, get cycled out department to department. And this next thing is near and dear to me. We need a Justice Department that understands its role in protecting vulnerable communities and enforce accountable and constitutional policing. DOJ needs to open a pattern and practice investigation to address systemic problems that are so clearly in display in Minneapolis. We have a Justice Department instead that has literally gutted the Civil Rights Division's police reform work that was mandated by Congress. In the absence of real leadership at DOJ, members of Congress as well as state and local leaders need to push for concrete change. Seriously, nothing less will do. The Leadership Conference Education Fund released a report last year called The New Era of Public Safety that lays out concrete community-centered policy solutions to equip communities and police departments with best practices for adopting 21st century policing models, including tools for advocacy, building on President Obama's 21st century policing task force. Platitudes about racial equality right now are not going to cut it. Commitment to equality requires this kind of concrete action now, and we cannot let anyone distort the work that we have to do to honor Mr. Floyd's life and the lives of so many more who've been killed by police brutality. The outpourings of grief and generational pain are a response not only to unjust policing of Black people, they are a cry for public officials to finally take concrete action and demand a new paradigm for policing. We cannot go through this cycle again. And now is the time for those in our nation's highest offices and in states around the country to end state-sanctioned violence and pass meaningful police reform legislation. It's finally time to build an America where all people can live safely and freely. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Vanita. And now we'll go to Derrick Johnson.
Thank you, Mark. And I am glad to be here with my colleagues in the civil rights community during this most unique time. And for the NAACP, I was sitting here and I was tracking how long have we been in this posture. For the last 80 days, it will probably go down in history of one of the most impactful moments of our time, starting with a global pandemic and an anemic response from this administration, causing many people to suffer through this health crisis, only to learn of the disparate impact it's having on the African American community. And again, an anemic response from this administration, forcing states to scramble to try to adjust to address this issue without the necessary resources that any other pandemic can happen. And all of these things as a result of a decision made, an outcome of the 2016 elections. But the underfunding of the CDC, the dissolving of the Office of Pandemic Diseases, all of these things could have been avoided, only to find ourselves in the middle of an economic crisis where a record number of individuals have been laid off or furloughed, and our economy is going in a downward spiral. But yet African are exposed as essential workers, but not being compensated as essential workers and confronted with the health challenges of the day. For us then to wake up and recognize that we've had a violent action in the state of Georgia where two individuals, one a former law enforcement officer, decided to chase and hunt down someone who was simply jogging, and nothing was done until a video was revealed, only to wake up and learn of a woman sleeping in her bed in Louisville, Kentucky, where the police break into her house with a defective warrant, looking for someone they had already apprehended, and to kill her. To wake up to realize that for 8 minutes and 46 seconds, we witnessed on television 4 officers kill an individual, commit murder in front of everyone. Several camera angles, but to realize that that district attorney decided that he needed more information and not to bring those officers to justice, only to then wake up later to learn of Amy Cooper in Central Park, who decided that she was going to break the law by simply not having her dog on a leash, and Mr. Cooper, not related, enjoying the moment in Central Park to bird watch and asking her simply to please put your dog on a leash, and for her to react and practice her acting skills and commit a racial hate crime by reporting a false crime saying a Black man is attacking me, only for the citizens of Minneapolis to finally get tired of being treated in a way in which in December of 2019, the NAACP, we produced a report about the Twin Cities, and we talked about the hardship, the economic disparities that African Americans were facing in both Minneapolis and St. Paul. And we said in that report that if the situation is not addressed soon, we're looking at a matter of a time before there was an explosion. And we've seen that explosion when citizens began to take to the streets for peaceful protests to get that district attorney to finally serve justice for our community. It is unfortunate that justice can be held up by one individual who is elected, by the way, only for those peaceful protests to devolve to riots and violence, and to force the hand of this nation to finally confront two central problems that have plagued us for many years. One being the structural racism that we have been fighting against for many, many years, for the NAACP for 111 years, the oldest civil rights organizations, and many of our partners, their organizations for a number of years as well. And the other issue is policing and the lack of accountability that our law enforcement officers have in terms of their ability to rain terror on our community with impunity. We are at a juncture in time where the thing we must do is cast a big vision around policy implementation, and you've heard some of that on this call, but to turn the vote out in November. All of these things come down to elections. The election of 2016 with the current occupancy of the White House, the election of the district attorney in Georgia who refused to bring charges, and they had to take the case out of her hand and bring in a special prosecutor because she simply would not be accountable to that community. An elected district attorney in Minneapolis who held this nation hostage until finally the governor took the case out of his hands so that the state attorney general can finally address this case properly. For African Americans, for all Americans, we must confront the reality of where we are. Racism has been here, it will continue to be here until we own and take responsibility to change it. And that change is around structural change, institutional change, and public policy change must lead the way, but we cannot get there unless until we turn out the vote. So for the NAACP, our role in this process is to increase voter turnout, and we're asking our neighbors across the country, if you want a community of decency, if you would like a stable economy, if you think that the quality of your health, if you want a society that is well, and the health of a society is based on three basic factors. How well are we caring for our elderly? Are we preparing our young people for a bright future? And are we protecting the rights of those who we identify as disadvantaged? And if that is the criteria by which we are governed, then we are truly living in a sick society, and the medicine for that sickness is in November. It is not the only medicine, but it's a start to go in the right direction. Hitting in the streets and having a temporary moment of violence and satisfaction will not create the solutions that we're looking for. And my colleagues and Senator Harris and Senator Booker and Chairwoman Baz, they have the policy direction, but we need to give them the tools to move that forward. And those tools is through the vote. So I am proud to be with all of my counterparts here today as we organize towards November. This is not simply about the civil rights community. This is not simply about the African American community. This is about how are we going to save this democracy. Anarchy is something that none of us desire, but civility is something that we all are working towards. So we're asking you to join all of our counterparts on this press conference today as we fight to make democracy work for all. Thank you.
Derrick, thank you so much. And to all my civil rights colleagues along with our elected allies. We want to thank you for joining. Let's go to the questions. It's about 3:25 now. If civil rights colleagues, if you could stick with us, those of you who can, for another 10 to 15 minutes, we're going to take as many questions as we can. Those that we do not get to, we're going to try to respond to you in writing in the interest of time. So Teresa Kandori will read the question and I'll moderate the response, either give an answer or call on one of our colleagues to respond.
Good
Teresa?
afternoon. Our first question is from Sarah Lynch of Reuters, and this is for anyone on the panel. In your view, which police departments have done well in dealing with the crowds and protests, and which police departments have made mistakes which risk further straining relationships with the community?
Any colleague want to take that question? Sherrilyn, Derrick?
Well, I think we've seen a number of police departments that have made particular kinds of decisions in Flint, Michigan, in Camden, New Jersey. I would say even last night, although it remains to be seen in Baltimore, there are police departments that are making decisions about how they want to engage the public. Every police department's response is the result of a decision that's been made. And I've been somewhat encouraged to see that there are some police departments that have demonstrated that police can make the decision to operate in a constitutional fashion, can give protesters an opportunity to speak, to exercise their First Amendment rights, to vent their anger, their justifiable anger. And in some instances, police have even marched with protesters, most importantly, talked with protesters and listened. Yesterday, outside the Baltimore Police Department, there was a police lieutenant who, at the urging of the crowd, read the names of all of those, or at least some of those who have been killed by police violence. So there are places where police departments are making decisions and to listen, and in some instances, even to march with protesters. And it's important to know that those options exist.
Thank you very much. Next question.
Zach Cohen from National Journal asks, would you support amending the 1033 program that transfers excess military equipment to civilian law enforcement?
Let me ask Senator Booker. I think Senator Booker's with us. Question with respect to legislation, Senator.
I'm sorry, the audio where I am was bad. I didn't hear the full question.
Yeah,
I heard it was about legislation.
Just repeat the question.
Would you support amending the 1033 program that transfers excess military equipment to civilian law enforcement?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes, go ahead, Senator.
Yeah, this is something, when I talked about the comprehensive bill that we put together, this is something that is in that as well. And there's a number of different efforts, everything from the NDAA reforms all the way to the overt legislative reforms that we're working on. So yes, the short answer is yes. And I know I speak for a lot of other members of the Congressional Black Caucus, as well as the Senate for that as well.
Thank you, Senator Booker. Tess, next question.
Andrew Ford of the Gannett newspapers notes that New Jersey and Newark show the worst racial disparity in the nation for car chase deaths. These chases frequently start with traffic violations and usually don't end with an arrest. Even when a subject is captured, the driver is not charged with a serious crime. Will proposed legislation address police car chases?
So let me give a response, and then I'll invite everyone to give a response. When I was mayor of New Orleans, we stopped car chases. We stopped it precisely because with limited exception, that being someone was wanted for a very serious offense and they were fleeing. But as a general rule, we didn't do car chases. And we stopped it because, number one, too many innocent citizens were being hurt, injured, and in some instances killed. Number two, that produced a mountain of lawsuits, a mountain of workers' compensation claims, and a mountain of destroyed automobiles. The cost was far, 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 far greater than the benefit. So what I would say is that while certainly national legislation might be able to address that, each city, each mayor, each police chief can basically create a more limited car chase policy or car chase policy that is much safer for citizens. These car chases many times equate to a cops and robbers routine, as though it's in the movies. And most of the time, the cost outweighs any benefit. So I would suggest that that issue is best addressed, and Sherrilyn talked about this, that every issue with respect to police reform is not necessarily about national legislation. There's got to be a will in City Hall. There's got to be a will at the City Council. There's got to be a will, if you will, at the police department with police leadership to adopt more progressive policies and eliminating or significantly reducing car chases is a progressive policy that I would encourage most departments or encourage every department to undertake. Let's take the next question.
Go ahead.
Jonathan Salat of New Jersey Advanced Media notes that most people who are stopped for possession of marijuana are people of color. What impact would legalizing marijuana have on these interactions between police and people of color?
Anyone want to take that question?
This is somebody from the Jersey media, and I would very much like to respond.
Go ahead,
The Marijuana Justice Act, that was one of the earlier bills that I introduced, really spoke directly to that we have an outrageous reality when it comes to marijuana enforcement in this country, no difference between blacks and whites for using or selling, but blacks are almost 4 times more likely to be incarcerated for it. So legalization with expungement of records is critically important, and I can go deeper into that, Jonathan, as you know, but I'm going to say this. We know, and I think Vanita brought this up as well as some of the other civil rights leaders, that police departments, if they do not keep this data on who they're stopping for marijuana and a lot of the other critical information, then there could be incredible disparities in the way law enforcement is being done. The call that was expressed by civil rights leaders on about strengthening the DOJ, getting them back into the process of holding police departments accountable, doing consent decrees, all of these things would help to better create transparency within marijuana enforcement, stops, traffic stops, and more, and better give tools to hold those police departments accountable and give the federal government a lot more leverage over doing it. I speak as someone that at first did not see the federal government, DOJ, coming into Newark's policing as a thing, but quickly realized how important it is, how good it is for a community, for a city, and frankly, how it could help you get to the ends of just policing. So in the larger context, you know where I stand on marijuana enforcement. I think that it would go a long way, but I just have to say the DOJ has a role to play in holding police accountable, and we need to see them rise to that again. Thank you, Mark.
Thank you, Senator Booker. Next question, Tess.
Laverne McGee of the Black News Channel asks, is there one unified plan among Black leadership to deal with police reform?
So let me say this, and then I'm going to turn it to Sherrilyn. While there are a range of ideas, I think what Sherrilyn laid out, her 5-point plan, reflects the core of what many of us believe should be done. And there are some additional things. Is there a unified plan? There's a unified commitment. And I think we're now working with the members of Congress to make sure that at the federal level, we're clear on what type of measures we want to move as quickly as possible. So I think there's a unified commitment, but let me let Sherrilyn respond, because I think her 5 points, I think reflects the core of where most of us are and what we think is important both at the national and the local level. Sherrilyn?
Thank you, Mark, and thank you for the question. Let me be clear. The 5 points that I mentioned are really 5 measures of a much larger set of measures that are available and have been available for some time. There is no confusion about what we want. I mean, the question about 1033 equipment, we talked about ad nauseum 5 years ago. President Obama had a 21st Century Policing Commission in which many of us participated and testified. And the report of that commission contains recommendations that all of us endorsed. So there is no confusion about the measures that civil rights leaders support in terms of policing reform. We have been talking about this ad nauseum for the last 5 years. It is now time for movement, and that movement, you know, it's interesting. Much of the conversation in the early stages was about the police themselves and about community policing and about retraining police and doing bias training and so forth. And those things are still important. What we're doing today is emphasizing something very different. We're not talking about training individual officers, because you know what? I look at Officer Chauvin with his hands in his pocket, 19 years on the force. There's no training that's going to change that officer. For those who talk about our own behavior, you can't talk to your child about how to manage an encounter with someone like that. So now what we're talking about are the measures that we have been talking about, which is that we've got to have the law work on our side to hold police officers accountable. Accountability is key. And if you don't think that you're accountable for your misconduct, you won't change your conduct. That's true in your workplace. That's true in my workplace. So yes, there are a number of measures that all of us have supported. I direct people to that 21st Century Policing Report, which is collecting dust on a shelf in the Department of Justice. I direct folks to the website of the Leadership Conference on Civil Rights, which is an umbrella organization of over 100 civil rights organizations that all together have identified the measures that we need to change around policing. It's all there available, but now we need elected officials, we need Congress, we need mayors, we need city council persons, and police leadership, the International Association of Chiefs of Police. We need them to move and make change.
So I think and also that many of us have plans, but these plans all dovetail with each other. They're consistent with each other. The most important thing about police reform, and I think Sherrilyn made this, is it operates both at the national level and at the local level, not exclusively at one level. So let's take the next question.
Dave Goldener from the New York Daily News asks, what would a day of mourning on Thursday entail?
Is Reverend Sharpton still with us?
He is not.
Okay, let me respond. So a day of mourning is a day where, consistent with what the family of George Floyd has called for, becomes a call for a day of peace, a call for a day when people focus their energies on the memory of Mr. Floyd. Mr. Floyd is not a statistic. Mr. Floyd is not a news story. Mr. Floyd is not a symbol. Mr. Floyd is a person. Mr. Floyd was a person with a family who loved him, who cared for him. If we're going to respect his dignity, then on the day that he is sent home, on the day he is remembered, on the day he is funeralized, we think it ought to be a day, not only a day of peace, but a day when people take a gesture, say a prayer, participate in a moment of silence, either as a collective or as an individual, to remember and recognize Mr. Floyd, and also to reaffirm a commitment. And it's the commitment that each of us has made. And that is that there be justice for Mr. Floyd. Mr. Floyd's family, Mr. Floyd's loved ones are in deep mourning. This man did not need to die. He should not have died. He should not have died. He's a person. He has loved ones. He's like each and every one of us. Let's take a day. We're suggesting a day free of any violence to respect the memory of Mr. Floyd. We're going to take one more question. Everyone's been extremely patient. We appreciate all of you who joined this Zoom call to listen to us today. We'll take one more question, and then from that point, we'll take the other questions that were in the queue. We'll try to respond to you in writing, hopefully within the next 24 hours. So one more question, Tess.
Todd Ruger from Roll Call notes that similar proposals have stalled in Congress after similar past events. Is there anything different about this time, and which proposals might Senator Mitch McConnell bring to the floor, or President Donald Trump might sign.
Senator Booker, would you want to take that?
Yes, I certainly will. Look, I know this, and a number of the civil rights organizations on this call have pointed it out. Number one, we have a nation where you're seeing more receptivity to ideas that just 4 or 5 years ago, when I would bring it up, would seem resistant. You have big city police chiefs and others openly calling for certain reforms or interested in working on certain reforms. So that's pretty significant. And this is all, again, I think, as Sherrilyn and others have said, lay upon a bed of a really good work done in the 21st century task force policing, which had a lot of the ideas you hear floating around. I think you have a lot of energy and demand. I think you have, and without giving you names, I'm talking Republican colleagues of mine who are interested in working and partnering on reform efforts. So I have a lot of hope, as has been expressed on this call, that we have not just energy around this, but specific ends and ideas that we want to see driven through. But I have no illusion of how difficult it is to get things done with Mitch McConnell there as a majority leader. In fact, I was told by Republicans who were allies of mine in getting the criminal justice reform bill done, that Mitch McConnell didn't seem to be wanting that bill to get to the floor. So we clearly have work to do if we want to get something done this Congress. And then, as Derrick said so powerfully, President Johnson said, this election, I think that this could very well be an election that determines whether we see broad-based policing reforms in our country or not. And I think that I can't predict what's going to happen over the next 160 days between now and the election, but this could very well be a compelling reason that drives many people to the polls who want to see real reform in our country. So new coalitions are emerging with unusual partners are emerging. That gives me hope. And then the energy you see right now, should it translate into more efforts electorally, and not just for national offices, but remember, so many of your attorneys general, so many of your prosecutors, critical prosecutors, mayors and others around this country are chosen at the local level. Those are the folks that drive local change. I see this potentially transitioning into a huge voter turnouts, with this being a major election issue in 2020. And that, especially if we take back the United States Senate, would give us a platform to make some very strong changes in police accountability nationally.
Senator Booker, thank you. And to Senator Booker, Senator Harris, Representative Bass, Reverend Sharpton, Derrick Johnson, Melanie Campbell, Sherrilyn Ifill, Kristen Clarke, and Vanita Gupta, thank you for joining us today. To each of you, members of the media who have joined us, this entire press event will be available online within the next 24 hours. You can follow up with our press people if you have any further questions. We deeply appreciate you. We're unified today in saying, number one, we must mourn Mr. Floyd with respect and with dignity. And we're calling on everyone to treat this Thursday as a national day of mourning as he is funeralized in Minneapolis, Minnesota. Number two, we're calling on all people all across the nation to unite behind the idea that it is time to reform policing in America. It's high time. It's overdue. If this has not been a wake-up call for America, I don't know what a wake-up call is. The pain, the anguish, the reaction that's been visceral, it's been real, it's been humane, it's been compassionate, that has resulted, as we've seen what we saw. Our eyes don't lie. That video was not a reality TV show. That video was real. Mr. Floyd did not deserve to die. So in honor of Mr. Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, Trayvon Martin, Michael Brown, Sandra Bland, Tamir Rice, Eric Garner, and the countless others of men and women, named and unnamed, Black people in America who died because of police violence. It's our determination to see to it this time that we reform policing in America. Thank you for joining us. We hope to see you next time we gather to speak in a unified fashion. Have a good day.
Thank you, Mark.